The year is 1953. Less than a decade has passed since the Great Conflict, yet the world is once more divided, locked in a chilling, protracted struggle known only by the cold, stark designation: the Cold War. The battlefields have shifted from the trenches of Europe to the skies over Korea, and the weapon of choice is the swift, screaming phenomenon of the jet engine. For the pilots of the free world, one enemy in the sky was a persistent, terrifying question mark: the Soviet Union's most advanced interceptor, the MiG-15. The intelligence agencies of the United States had long coveted a look beneath the skin of this aerial adversary. In the quiet laboratories and design bureaus of both East and West, a remarkable shared lineage existed, a historical irony known to few. The very heart of these screaming metal birds, the powerful jet engine, traced its ancestry back to one man, the British visionary Frank Whittle. Back in the early 40s, the United States had received the fruits of Whittle's labor to propel their first jet fighters, like the Lockheed F-80 Shooting Star, designed by none other than Kelly Johnson. Simultaneously, and perhaps more controversially, the Soviet Union acquired his designs, or engines outright, from Rolls-Royce, reverse engineering them to birth their own aerial champion, the MiG-15. This story begins not with a battle, but with an act of calculated defiance and high reward. The United States Air Force issued an audacious challenge: a $100,000 bounty for the pilot who would defect and deliver a flyable MiG into their hands. On a late summer day in September of 1953, the gamble paid off. A North Korean pilot, taking a desperate chance, slipped through the enemy lines and landed his prize at Kimpo Air Base in South Korea. The capture of this aircraft, known as Project Moolah, was an event of seismic importance, setting off an immediate, top-priority examination by America's greatest test pilots and engineers. From the moment the wheels touched the tarmac, the clock was ticking. Every bolt, every wire, every performance metric would be stripped bare. The findings would influence every design decision for the next generation of Western fighters. What they found, and what it revealed about the nature of Soviet aviation, is a story of technology, espionage, and the high-stakes game of the Cold War, the most important aircraft defection of the 20th century.
On 21 September 1953, the lid came off one of the most controversial subjects of recent years. It was the MiG-15, the red fighter interceptor surrounded by an aura of fact and fiction. Now we know about the MiG, what it can do and what it can't do. This is the story. The MiG landed at Kimpo Air Base at Seoul, Korea on Monday, September 21st. Its North Korean pilot collected $100,000 posted by the military for any pilot who could successfully deliver a MiG into our hands. At first, the plane was dismantled for shipment to the United States. But plans changed, and the MiG was taken to Okinawa instead. To prevent violating terms of the armistice, American officials offered to deliver it back to its rightful owners, but no takers came forward. The following Monday, at Kadena Air Force Base on Okinawa, the MiG was tugged out of the hangar ready to fly. Early in the morning, a plane load of Air Force specialists had arrived from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to conduct flight tests on the MiG. Major General Albert Boyd, commander of the Wright Air Development Center, was one of the trio of pilots who would fly the MiG. Captain H.E. Tom Collins, also of WADC, and Major C.E. Chuck Yeager of the Flight Test Center completed the trio. Air intelligence people already knew what to put in the plane: standard JP-1 fuel. Oil was standard Air Force 1010, but the hydraulic fluid was a mixture of glycerin, castor oil, and water. In the cockpit, Russian language instrument labels were translated to English, and the pilots familiarized themselves with instrument placement. More than a score of technicians from Air Technical Intelligence Center and WADC checked over the craft prior to its initial flight. The aircraft's communist markings were changed, and every inch of the plane was inspected to make sure the MiG was structurally sound and to ensure that the plane had not been booby-trapped. From the rear, the MiG's negative wing dihedral can be seen easily. Notice the large size of the rudder. Wing fences act as flow dividers to improve low-speed handling characteristics. Since the MiG's rightful owners might demand the plane back at any time, flight testing was begun immediately. The Jet Assist starting unit was standard Air Force equipment, the only modification being a specially made adapter plug. Metric system calibrated instruments were replaced by standard Air Force counterparts. An accelerometer was added since the MiG had no provision for one. An external free air temperature gauge was also added for test purposes. Later, a gun camera was rigged to take pictures through the gun sight during firing passes. Preliminary engine run and taxi tests were begun on the evening of the 28th in spite of rainy weather. During these, the braking system was checked. The MiG has no steerable nose wheel, but instead depends on differential braking of the main wheels to turn. Brakes are pneumatically operated from a compressed air bottle. No compressor is carried. Hence, the supply of braking air is extremely limited. The compressed air is also designed as an emergency system to operate the flaps and landing gear. Captain Collins climbed into the plane the following afternoon to become the first American to fly a MiG-15. On a later flight, two F-86 chase planes started down the runway at the same time. Notice how the MiG easily outdistances them due to the MiG's low thrust loading. This factor explains the unusually good climb characteristics of the MiG. On the first flight, tests were made to determine low-altitude level flight handling characteristics at medium speeds. Functional tests were made of all systems, landing gear, controls, speed brakes, and engine, as well as handling characteristics in the landing pattern. Both in the air and on the ground, the MiG has an unusually clean appearance. Up close, it can be seen that while workmanship is good in vital skin areas, less important areas have been somewhat neglected. A coating of transparent lacquer covers the plane to reduce drag, but at the same time, MiG designers have ironically added an external antenna. The craft proved basically sound, and all systems operated properly. It handled conventionally at medium and low speeds. Approach speed on the base leg was 150 knots, final approach 120 knots, and speed at touchdown 105 knots. Landing characteristics were similar to those of the F-80. To minimize brake wear, no attempt was made to shorten landings. Much of the plane's equipment was copied from obsolescent American equipment, such as the ARN-7 radio compass receiver. The copies, however, showed good workmanship. A unique feature of the MiG-15 is its armament system. Two 23mm cannons and one 37mm cannon are positioned beneath the air intake. Both guns and ammunition are contained in a package which can be lowered by one man. This feature greatly shortens the MiG's turnaround time, since a preloaded package can be slung under a returned MiG and accurately positioned almost immediately. Fortunately, the plane was delivered to the Air Force combat loaded, so armament tests could be made. When the cannons are firing, both shell casings and ammunition links are jettisoned. ammunition can be fired steadily for only 6 seconds, as opposed to 14 seconds with the F-86. During flight tests, several air-to-water strafing runs were made to check gun sight accuracy, as well as static firing tests into a fixed target. It is interesting to note that throughout the performance tests, data obtained compared with uncanny accuracy with information previously acquired on the MiG by Air Technical Intelligence Center. The flights made by General Boyd and Major Yeager added to the knowledge that was piling up. A series of high-altitude dives at high Mach numbers showed the MiG became difficult to control as speed increased, and at Mach .94, the aircraft became uncontrollable, pulling out only on reaching denser air. The top speed of the MiG was slightly less than the F-86 at all altitudes, although the MiG's rate of climb exceeds the F-86 at all altitudes. The MiG climbs to 45,000 feet in 9 minutes, while the F-86 takes 13 minutes. During dives, the F-86 is completely controllable at speeds which render the MiG control systems useless. During an altitude test, the MiG was climbed to 55,000 feet, while the F-86 could reach only 51,000 feet. In general, MiG handling characteristics at all speeds are not so good as the F-86 because of the MiG's small aileron surface and lack of elevator effectiveness. The MiG is most effective as a combat fighter at lower speeds, where its lower thrust loading allows greater maneuverability. Pilot protection on the MiG consists of an armor-plated ejection seat back of adequate thickness and the usual bulletproof glass. Fuel tanks, located in the fuselage, were not self-sealing. Oxygen and cabin temperature systems require constant pilot attention, as did most of the equipment in the plane. Pilots reported cabin temperatures as high as 42 degrees centigrade at low altitudes and below freezing temperatures at high altitudes. These extremes in working environments would seriously limit a MiG pilot's performance. At the conclusion of the tests, the tally sheet read like this. Desirable features of the MiG. 1. Ability of the MiG to operate over 50,000 feet. 2. High rate of climb. 3. Rapid acceleration from low speeds. 4. Short turning radius. 5. Short takeoff and landing distance. On the undesirable side of the score sheet are these. 1. Loss of aircraft control at high Mach numbers. 2. Loss of pilot vision due to inadequate defrosting and poor rearward visibility. 3. Poor lateral directional stability at high altitudes. 4. Slow rate of roll. 5. Equipment requires constant pilot attention. Compared with the F-86, the MiG is an inferior though still formidable weapon. The 13-to-1 kill ratio of F-86s over MiGs can be attributed directly to superior planes and better trained pilots. 4 days and 11 flights after the test program started, the MiG had no secrets left.
In 1951, a Mikoyan Goryevich MiG-15 is shot down over Korea's west coast and plummets into the Yellow Sea. The jet is pulled from the shallow water by US and South Korean forces, transported by a British frigate for study. At a US Air Force base in Dayton, Ohio, the plane is pored over. One of the first discoveries of this incredible aircraft comes when the engine is inspected. Expecting to find a hybrid of Russian and German jet technology, the team studying the captured prize receive a shock. The plane is powered by what appears to be a Rolls-Royce Nene 2, designed in England. 1940. Since the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Germany and the Soviet Union have been in an alliance, using their combined might to carve up Eastern Europe. With France giving in quickly to the Nazis, England's newly appointed Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, knows that German troops will soon be clambering up the English beachfront. He decides to send a new ambassador to Moscow, and a member of Parliament volunteers for the job. He is Richard Stafford Cripps. Born into privilege, Cripps' first love is chemistry, and following a stint as an ambulance driver during the Great War, he studies law and becomes a successful attorney, before an interest in politics lures him to run for office. Cripps joins the Labour Party, and in 1930 becomes Solicitor General in Ramsay MacDonald's government, a position that includes the honour of becoming a knight. Though regarded by all as a brilliant man, Sir Stafford Cripps has a tendency to ruffle feathers, and soon finds himself clashing with Labour over his political leanings. Some of his views are considered so extremely left-wing by the Labour Party that he's chased out. Now sitting as an independent, he finds himself on a trip to Moscow, with a goal of aligning the Soviet Union with Britain.
Stafford Cripps was certainly born into a life of privilege, and his father was a Conservative MP. This no doubt stimulated his own interest in politics. But what I think really led him into his own particular line in politics was really his religion. We can't understand Stafford Cripps unless we understand that he was a committed Christian who had very fervent beliefs. In some ways they seem rather naive. They're certainly idealistic. He believed in the brotherhood of man. The crucial event for him was really the economic crisis of 1931, when Britain was hit by the so-called economic blizzard that swept away the Labour government and seemed to indicate that the capitalist system simply wasn't coping and couldn't cope. This led Cripps from being a moderate member of the Labour Party into adopting Marxism, which naturally involved a degree of sympathy with the Soviet Union.
In 1940, while the Battle of Britain rages, Cripps arrives in Moscow. While hope is high that he can steer Russia into an alliance with England, early results are not at all promising. Just days after Cripps has a 3-hour meeting with Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Premier and Foreign Commissar Vyacheslav Molotov gives a speech on how successful the Russian-German alliance has been for the country. Cripps continually warns Stalin not to trust Hitler, but to no avail.
The key episode was really from 1940 to 1941, when he went to Russia as Britain's ambassador. And what he found there certainly changed his view and formed what to many people will seem a surprisingly unfavourable view of Soviet Russia for such a left-wing figure.
From his book, The Cripps Version, Dr. Peter Clark reads Cripps' correspondence with his daughter during the politician's time as ambassador in Russia.
He's talking about the regime and says that it has many difficulties, perhaps due partly because they're inherent in every form of dictatorship. And he continues in this way: if to all these difficulties you add the government by secret police and spies, which is the only method for a dictatorship, then in such a country as this, with a people of this kind apt to intrigue and brought up in underground revolutionary activities, you get perpetual change of personnel and liquidation of many of the more intelligent people, creating new difficulties of organisation. In the passage I just quoted, we see already, surely, that Cripps accepts that this is essentially a dictatorship, it is essentially a police state, that it is in many ways a deeply unattractive society. During the war, admittedly, he argued very strongly in favour of alliance with Russia as the best way to beat Hitler's Germany. But long before the end of the war, he was certainly no ideological captive of the communist system.
Within a year, Cripps' warnings about Hitler's trustworthiness become all too real, and Stalin must face the awful truth. Operation Barbarossa begins, as Nazi Germany storms into Soviet-controlled territory and pushes Stalin's forces back. It's a swift, fiery onslaught that knocks the Red Army back on its heels. It's a turn of events which suits Winston Churchill just fine. Not only does this new Eastern Front relieve some of the pressure on his troops, but it gives him, and particularly Cripps, clout with Stalin and amongst the Russians. A bond is forged over their common enemy, and soon an Anglo-Russian alliance is formed. But Churchill may be on shaky ground at home. Not only do the Russian politicians embrace Cripps, but the British public do as well. After a broadcast to the nation on the situation in Russia, Cripps is suddenly one of the most popular men in the nation, even seen as a contender for the position of Prime Minister. At a time when defeats are plentiful, Cripps makes it known that he'd be ready to take up the post if Churchill is unable to manage. Churchill seizes on this. In March of 1942, he sends his new rival to India in order to broker a deal with Gandhi and Jinnah. If the Cripps mission is a success, India will aid the war effort against the Nazis in exchange for self-rule once the conflict is at an end. But the mixed messages Cripps seems to be giving to the Indian negotiators during the trip causes it to end with no deal in place. The Indian Congress Party will not agree to aid England in the war. But aid is coming from another source. Through its Lend-Lease program, the United States of America begins to send supplies to the Allied forces in exchange for gold. They supply vast numbers of vehicles throughout the war, and Britain is the main beneficiary of the deal. The Soviet Union is far behind the West in technological advances, and needs aid as well. Russia receives close to 15,000 aircraft by the war's end, almost 20% of all the aircraft that they use. The most prominent of these is the Bell P-39 Airacobra. It's best suited for low-altitude flight due to its lack of turbo superchargers. Its unconventional layout, with the engine behind the pilot, leaves little room for storing fuel. The standard load is carried in the P-39's wings. It's therefore limited to short-range tactical strikes. The most advanced fighters and bombers the Americans keep for themselves. It aggravates the Soviets to be given the older technology, but they make do with what they're given. Of the equipment delivered, much of it is not suited to combat on the Eastern Front. Aircraft meant for tropical conditions are now used in a much colder climate. There are few spare parts, and so crews must sometimes improvise as best they can. The Soviets learn to adapt the Western technology to their needs and uses, skills that will serve them well in the years to come. 1945. First, Nazi Germany falls, and then so does Winston Churchill. The general election on July the 5th knocks the Conservatives from power and brings in a new Labour government, led by the wartime coalition government's Deputy Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. The public feels that the Labour Party will be more adept at helping England rebuild in the post-war period. Joining Attlee's cabinet as Minister of the Board of Trade is Sir Stafford Cripps.
The election of a Labour government in 1945 came as a great surprise to the world, who imagined that Winston Churchill would inevitably win re-election, having won the war. I think it's important to realise the strong elements of continuity, especially in foreign policy, that went over from Churchill's coalition wartime government, in which Labour had played a big part, into the post-war Labour government.
The main thrust of this new government is to rebuild the war-weathered country. It's about winning the peace by giving Britons a crutch to lean on. They use the 1942 Beveridge Report as a guide for reforming the country. Attlee brings about sweeping changes that will alter the country for decades to come. Free national health care, education for everyone up to the age of 15, social security. He works towards giving India and Burma their freedom. It's far removed from the direction that their ally America is heading. More and more nations adopt communism, and never comfortable with these ideals, America finds these new social developments within Britain curious and worrisome. Churchill was the sort of man Americans understood, and Attlee is no Churchill. He's small and modest, spares his words when they aren't needed. To Americans, the contrast is a sharp one that gives them pause. Labour's domestic policies seem much closer to communism than to capitalism.
Foreign policy was largely in the hands of the Prime Minister Clement Attlee and the very strong Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin. Now, both of them, in 1945 and 1946, were ready to take a much stronger line against the Soviet Union and its threat to the integrity of states in Eastern Europe than the Americans were at the time. So Attlee and Bevin had to argue with President Truman about the need to stand up to Soviet Russia. It wasn't really until events took their own course during 1946 that, in a sense, Truman came round to the rather harder line that the British government was already following. It's therefore somewhat surprising to find that in popular politics in the United States, Britain, simply because it had a Labour government, was then perceived as a weak link in the Western alliance. If you come down to the realities of the situation, you see that it's in fact British policy that is actually more consistent through the 1940s in taking a firm line in opposing Soviet expansionism. And Cripps, for all his previous sympathy with the Soviet Union, is firmly in support of the line of the government of which he's a leading member.
America's astounding capacity for production kept Britain well supplied during its darkest days following the Battle of Britain and supplemented their renewed manufacturing throughout the rest of the war. And now, very suddenly, the Lend-Lease program, that boon to Allied nations throughout the war, ends. America turns off the tap and stops the flow of resources into Britain. Not only that, they send the bill. Over £1 billion to be paid back over a 50-year period. As America is entering a post-war boom in prosperity, Britain is withering under its immense debt and damaged infrastructure. 750,000 homes damaged or destroyed. 1/3 of gold reserves spent. Food rationing becomes more stringent than it had been during the war. Coal, an absolute necessity for providing Britain with heat and manufacturing, is scarce.
We shall only get it right if we can produce much more than we did before the war. That's the only way we can get the things we need. Food, clothes, entertainment, a little less struggle to live, a decent home and warmth. We want colour in our lives, a better education for the kids, bigger pensions for the old people and all the rest. No doubt we're in a bit of a tough spot, and it'll take a year or two to get out. But we've done it before, and we can do it again.
And while the post-war situation is tumultuous for the common people, it's a windfall for the Allied militaries. Germany's defeat sees its treasure trove of technological secrets scatter for anyone looking to pick up the pieces. The Allied nations rush into German territory to recruit the top scientists and to integrate these advancements into their own country's technology. Russian forces lay their hands on the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin and the many secrets within it. Swept wings, rocket power, and the jet engine. With this information, they can make a vast leap ahead and finally begin to catch up to the Western powers. And since the pre-war days, when Stalin assessed his nation to be 50 to 100 years behind Western technology, the Soviet Union has been making great advancements. One Soviet manufacturer, the Mikoyan Guryevich Design Bureau, has been creating aircraft since 1940, establishing a solid reputation for creating fighter planes. Their first post-war design, the MiG-9, is powered by a copy of the captured German BMW 003 engine. As early jets go, it has a fairly conventional design, an all-metal fuselage with straight wings. For their second-generation jet aircraft, they'll be incorporating some new ideas in aerodynamics. But for all the advancements that they'd like to implement, the power plant is not up to snuff. The German jet engine that the Russians discover has its flaws. The axial flow system, while powerful, is difficult to maintain. Engines quickly burn out and must be replaced. Their short lifespans plagued German ground crews throughout the war, and though the Soviets pursue the creation of their own jet engine based on this technology, they find themselves facing the very same problems the Germans had. Germany's most advanced jet engine design is proving difficult to perfect. The new airframe designs that Mikhail Gordievich are creating will need something more advanced and reliable than the adapted German engine. To keep up with Western development, Russia will need a centrifugal flow jet engine, like Frank Whittle has developed in England. While not as powerful as the axial engine, it's reliable and has been a proven performer. Rolls-Royce has continued to make developments using Whittle's ideas, and currently have the Nene 2 engine, which, despite its great power, has only thus far been used in prototypes of the Hawker Seahawk and the failed Supermarine Attacker. Without an advanced jet engine, Russia's aircraft development will be at a standstill. The Soviet aviation minister Mikhail Khrushchev and designer Alexander Yakovlev suggest to Stalin that they purchase more advanced engines from another country. Stalin scoffs at Khrushchev's idea. What fool will sell us his secrets, he asks. Despite knowing that his men will fail on their journey to purchase this technology, Stalin allows the trade mission to go ahead. MiG's Artem Mikoyan, engine designer Vladimir Klimov and others travel to England to tour Rolls-Royce's plant and to see other British aircraft developments. When the trade mission lands in London, they find a socialist government ready to embrace them. There's still much goodwill afforded to Russia, still seen by British eyes as an ally in the noble war against Nazi forces. That, and post-war England needs money. The Soviet delegation tours the Rolls-Royce plant and are shown their latest engine developments, the Derwent and the Nene. They ask to purchase several of each. When the order comes across the desk of a Ministry of Supply employee, he warns Minister John Wilmot against selling the Soviets the technology. Britain is the absolute leader in jet engines. Russia is at least 5 years away from similar developments. Selling them one of the nation's greatest achievements would be, as Stalin has said, foolish. But the sale is pushed through by the President of the Board of Trade, Sir Stafford Cripps.
I think it was a socialist move to a socialist government, or an extreme Soviet government. We'd helped the Soviets before, or the Stalinists before, of course, at the beginning of World War II. But here I think this was going beyond the call of duty after the end of the war. And it certainly hurled them straight into the Premier League in aviation.
Despite a distrust of Stalin after his time in Moscow, Cripps sees the world breaking into two spheres of influence and wants to bring those sides together. Not only that, the sale means a good deal of money for Rolls-Royce at a time when big contracts are hard to come by. Cripps even offers to allow the Soviets to build the engine themselves under license.
The circumstances of the sale of the Rolls-Royce engines to Russia can't be divorced from Britain's economic predicament after the war, with a desperate need to increase exports. Cripps, as President of the Board of Trade, was the minister with primary responsibility for British trade. It's only natural, therefore, that he should have wanted to encourage expansion of British trade and opportunities for British exports in every direction possible. And certainly, in 1946, he was taking the view that Russia was a promising export market as far as British manufacturers were concerned. I think it's only natural, given all the circumstances, that he would have wanted to approve the sale of aircraft engines, which, after all, at that time, were not regarded as classified or restricted, had not been put under any sort of military ban. And there's frankly no need to seek further for an ideological explanation of his decision to approve a deal that he saw simply as being in the British national interest in order to revive British trade.
While Cripp's actions on the sale may have been honest, the Soviet delegations are less so. Rather than accepting the license, the Russian engine manufacturer Klimov begins to reverse engineer the Nien from the examples they've purchased. The Russians begin producing a version, the Klimov RD-45. But creating a successful engine is proving difficult. England has a long history of metallurgy dating back centuries. Small forges all over the British Isles have developed techniques to create strong metals from ores and minerals found throughout the empire that are perfect at handling the high stresses and heat associated with the power of a jet engine. Russian metallurgy is not nearly as advanced, and they find this one of their main stumbling blocks in duplicating the engine. The Nien can run 500 hours between overhauls, but the Klimov copy doesn't last more than 100. They increase the size of the combustion chambers and turbine and refine the alloys used to create the engine. This new model is known as the Klimov VK1. With the engine ready, they can now finalize designs. In April of 1947, the Council of Ministers issue a decree ordering Mikhail Gorbachev to build 2 prototypes of a new jet fighter, one that will put the Soviet Union ahead of the field in aircraft design. The Boeing B-29 has been America's frontline bomber since the final year of World War II. It's a revolutionary leap ahead of other aircraft, with its pressurized cabin and computer-assisted gun turrets. And now that the United States has the atomic bomb, the Soviet Union needs the future capabilities to defend against a bomber entering their territory with one of these tremendous weapons. The Council of Ministers want an interceptor for just such a situation. Mikhail Gorbachev looks back at their earlier aircraft to see any lessons they can learn. Their experimental canard plane, the MiG-8, had swept wings, a feature that they're interested in exploring further. Some captured German designs, like the TA-183 Hookebein, had swept wings implemented as well. Their latest jet, the MiG-9, has been promising, and they used this as the base to build from. Its engine troubles have been solved with the Klimov engine in place of the BMW power plant. It will also receive newly designed wings, swept back at an angle of 35 degrees. After some additional refinements, this new creation, the MiG-15, has a top speed of over 650 miles per hour. Though early production aircraft have a tendency to roll, these problems are lessened by adding aerodynamic trimmers near the ailerons and rudder. It's also recommended that pilots stay below Mach 0.9 to lessen any other stability problems. Test combat trials are conducted with a captured B-29 as well as the Soviet copy, the Tu-4. To shoot down the superfortress, the MiG-15 is armed with 2 23mm cannons and a single 37mm cannon. In 1949, production stops on the MiG-9, and the MiG-15 enters the Soviet Air Force. June the 25th, 1950. North Korean troops cross the 38th parallel into South Korean territory. By July the 5th, American forces have joined with the South Korean army. The United Nations also enters the fray under the guise of a police action. Soon, the conflict escalates beyond a ground war when the US calls for strategic bombing with its B-29s. In addition, piston engine fighters like the Mustang and the Corsair, left over from the Second World War, are joined by the jet-powered Gloucester Meteor and the F-80 Shooting Star. With the South Korean forces bolstered by UN support, North Korea also looks outside its borders for help. In October, Chairman Mao Zedong of China, fearing that a US occupation of the Korean peninsula would eventually lead to war with his country, sends a volunteer army into the fray. The North Korean and Chinese leaders ask Stalin for help. And while the Soviet dictator is unwilling to send in ground forces, he does provide aircraft in the form of the MiG-15 jet fighters, painted in Chinese colors to mask Soviet involvement. Soviet pilots are sent to train North Korean and Chinese airmen how to fly the fighter jets. They're taught simple Chinese phrases and dressed in Chinese uniforms and sent into the skies to combat and shoot down B-29s and engage the UN fighter forces. The piston-engine planes like the Mustang and the first-generation straight-winged jets are no match for the abilities of the MiG-15. It's faster, can fly higher and longer than any of its opponents. The Soviet victories come fast and often. The American pilots use their years of dogfighting experience to counter the superior technology at their enemy's disposal, but it's not always enough. Soon, B-29s are forced to limit their bombing runs to nighttime.
The first sighting of the MiG-15 in the Korean War, I think, had the same impact on pilots that as did the first sighting of the Focke-Wulf 190 just after the Battle of Britain, when it appeared in Europe. And we had nothing really to compare with it for the next year. Its success was due to two factors. One was the jet engine they had, the Nin, and the second one was, of course, the data they got from the captured German sources on the sweepback, wing sweepback. So it was a twin contribution, if you like.
Soviet air superiority begins to change in December of 1950, with the arrival of an all-new fighter aircraft for the American forces, the F-86 Sabre. First developed as the straight-winged F.J. Fury jet, its design has changed to incorporate 35-degree swept-back wings and automatic slats. The Sabre is not a leap ahead of the Soviet jet, but it does level the playing field. The discovery of an advanced British engine in the fuselage of a Russian-designed plane infuriates the Americans. This is not the first time the Soviets have made a huge leap ahead in military technology. The August 1949 detonation of Russia's first atomic bomb showed just how far they could advance technologically in a few years, with some outside help. First, Klaus Fuchs, a German-born scientist brought in by England to work on the Manhattan Project, has been arrested for providing the Soviet Union with atomic bomb designs. And at the moment, Donald Maclean, a high-ranking British Foreign Ministry official, is suspected by the FBI of providing the Soviets with a variety of information. As the British representative on the American, Canadian and British Atomic Secrets Council during the war, he's had access to nuclear secrets at a time when the quest for the bomb was known only to a few. It's in the autumn that UN forces finally get their hands on the MiG-15 and discover the secret of its power plant. It's confirmed when two men are dropped behind enemy lines to a crashed MiG-15, dug into the ground. No chance to remove the entire wreck, they use grenades to separate the engine. The Americans are livid. How could England have handed over a piece of powerful technology to Stalin's regime? But they have little time to blame Sir Stafford Cripps for selling the engines to their enemies. He's been retired for close to a year due to failing health. In October, Winston Churchill's Conservatives edge out the Labour Party, knocking Attlee out of government. Churchill, as Prime Minister once more, makes Anglo-American relations a priority again. And with him back in power, there's little chance that the Soviets will find any socialists to sell them other technology. In the northwest of Korea, in an area along the Yalu River, the first large-scale jet versus jet air battles of history take place, in an area dubbed MiG Alley. When the Sabres reach MiG Alley, they have only 20 minutes of fuel to engage the enemy with. The MiG-15s, with their bases nearby, can linger much longer. American pilots charge in at 40,000 feet, only to find the MiG-15s flying 10,000 feet above them. The MiGs hide in the sun's glare, then swoop in as a formation of Sabres are on patrol. The Russian fighter does have its share of weaknesses. The cannons it's equipped with, while powerful, have a low rate of fire compared to the Sabre's guns. It also has poor stalling characteristics. A Sabre pilot can force a MiG-15 into a dive that becomes a spin that cannot be recovered from. The combat experience of the United Nations pilots ultimately trumps the sophistication of the Soviet plane. By war's end, the UN forces have shot down 900 enemy aircraft, almost 800 of which are MiG-15s. But the aircraft has proven that the Soviets can use a blend of ingenuity and craftiness to match the West's innovation. Between the USSR, Czechoslovakia, Poland and China, over 16,000 MiG-15s are produced. In 1958, Rolls-Royce Deputy Chairman Whitney Straight is touring a factory in China when he sees an engine curiously similar to the Neen. Discovering that its origins lie in the reverse engineering of the Neen, he attempts to collect payment for the almost 50,000 engines that Klimov made by taking and adapting the design and licensing it to other countries for the MiG-15 and later aircraft. £200 million is the compensation he's looking for. He leaves without one farthing. The man whose decision led to the jet engine being copied is long since gone. Sir Stafford Cripps dies in April of 1952 in the midst of the Korean War. And while he's remembered mainly for his contributions to Britain's war effort and the post-war cultural shift, he will forever be tied to the MiG-15 by that one decision.
Cripps has always been, to a large extent, the prisoner of his own reputation, but it was a reputation that shifted over time. In the 1930s, his own high principles led him to take a very extreme political position on the far left of the political spectrum, arguing that only full-blooded socialism or even communism could offer an answer to the economic problems of the day. By the 1940s, Cripps's position is quite different from what it had been 10 years previously. It took people, quite naturally, some time to catch up with the rather rapid evolution through which he'd gone.
An evolution which is often overshadowed in aviation circles by this gift to Russia. A decision that may have been motivated by all the right reasons, but strengthens the might of the Soviet military for years to come.